Pokemon Pocket has recently undergone some major meta changes, and it's really due to one deck. Gyarados EX had a giant breakout weekend. It placed amazing at a lot of these major tournaments, the really large tournaments that happen every weekend. So playability has been on the rise. It's now the most played deck in most online tournaments. Because of Gyarados rising to the top, it has opened the door for Pikachu to come back into the meta in full swing. Pikachu has been placing very, very well. Both of these spell very good things for one archetype in particular, and that is fighting type decks. Fighting type decks take advantage of the weaknesses of both Pikachu and Gyarados the absolute best. So what we've seen in these online tournaments is fighting decks have been placing very, very well, better than they ever have. So what I want to do in today's video is go over all of the fighting variants we've seen do well and kind of walk you through the different play styles, which ones have better matchups against some decks over the other ones, and just which ones do I think are the best to be playing. So let's get into it. If you guys are enjoying the content, please consider subscribing. I have about 30,000 of you that consistently come back to the channel that have still yet to hit that subscribe button. So if that sounds like you, please consider it. I would really appreciate it. Now, there are really two main ways to play fighting types in Pokemon Pocket. The first type that we're going to look at are these slower, bulkier builds. Golem has kind of been the top dog in this category. Golem had a massive breakout performance. It placed first in the Ursa Day Pocket Weekly. A complete blindside to everyone. The conditions were just absolutely perfect for this Golem deck. It takes a pretty good matchup against Gyarados. There were a lot of Pikachus around as well. So the Pikachus were preying on the Gyarados, and then the Golem was preying on the Gyarados and the Pikachu. So it just allowed it to rise to the top. This deck has some fantastic matchups across the board. Using that Druddigon to wall and set up your Golem, once that Golem starts swinging, there's really nothing in the format that's gonna one-shot it besides either a fully powered up Celebi or a Charizard EX, which is good news for Golem because Celebi EX has been on the downswing, and Charizard EX, we've seen it do some things in the meta, but for the most part, it's kind of an abandoned deck. It'll get some placements here and there, but no one's really playing it as much because that Mew EX has swung that matchup so much in just whatever deck plays Mew EX's favor over Charizard. So the idea with this deck is you have the Hitmonlee to bully those Magikarps on the bench. It's really the best way to deal with Gyarados. And if they do get into the Gyarados, what you sometimes need is that Hitmonlee in order to weaken it before it comes up. Gyarados wins games by getting Gyarados set up and sending it up with 0 damage on it. That is the best way. It's the best route to victory Gyarados has. It has 180 HP. Nothing's really one-shotting it. Gyarados is one-shotting most things in the meta. So if Gyarados can get into the active spot with no damage on it, you're probably looking at a lost cause there. It's very tricky to overcome a fully powered up Gyarados, no damage in the active spot. So Hitmonlee gives you that option to just snip the Gyarados before it can even become a Gyarados, take out that Magikarp on the bench. But even if you don't, you still have the Golem. Golem is one of the few Pokemon that's not going to get one-shot by Gyarados. Ideally, you wouldn't want to send the Golem up until that Gyarados has already come into the active spot. So you'd really want to be pressuring with Hitmonlee in order to build up the damage on that Gyarados beforehand. Just force your opponent, make them play their hand, make them say, all right, this Gyarados is just getting bullied on the bench. I need to start taking prizes with it. And then you can go into your Golem and you will win the two-shot war there. It also just has a fantastic Pikachu matchup. Golem's gonna one-shot a Pikachu. It has the Giovanni to one-shot a Zapdos, and Pikachu attacking into Golem is very, very funny because at max, Pikachu is gonna do 60 damage to Golem. This deck also does pretty well against Mewtwo. Mewtwo players have to really play their heart out to get around it because they're not going to be one-shotting a Golem. Golem has the threat of one-shotting a Mew if it comes into the active spot without using a, what is it called? Whatever the copying attack is called, to copy Golem and get that damage reduction. So very, very scary for them to put a Mew into the active spot at any point. That Golem is always just one Giovanni away from one-shotting it. And yeah, just from a lot of the games I've played against Mewtwo, they have to consistently be bouncing back and forth these EXs because we can usually take a single prize card early. And if they don't take a prize and we go in with our Golem We do have that Marshadow in the back that can just finish off whatever EX. So if you can just take one prize early on against the Mewtwo, it becomes super, super hard for them. You can do that with the Hitmonlee, maybe pinging some Ralts on the bench. Or you can even just leave Druddigon in the active spot, build up a Golem, maybe 2, and a Marshadow, and they're just not in a good spot. It's tricky for them, it's doable for them, but it's not an unfavored matchup by any means. This deck also does fine against the fire stuff that isn't Charizard EX. Mainly you're seeing Arcanine or you're seeing Ninetales, Rapidash. Ninetales Rapidash does have the ability to just rush you off the board. You don't really have good counters to it besides the Golem, but if you can get into that Golem, the matchup is a breeze. They're just not doing enough. Golem's going to take 2 prizes, and then you might have a Marshadow in the back to finish the game off. Against Arcanine, if they swing with that Arcanine either into a Druddigon or just them attacking, they are now in range of a Golem attack plus a Giovanni. 130 is just such a great number for Golem to be hitting that gives it the edge in a lot of these relevant matchups we're seeing. Really, the worst matchup for it is going to be Celebi, but like I said, we haven't seen too much Celebi running around. Celebi players are able to start attacking with one Celebi or some other attacker and build up a big Celebi in the back. So once you finally get into that Golem, you're just able to take a one-shot. If Celebi players play it right, they should not have a hard time with Golem, because, again, a lot of Golem's strength is just the fact that it's not going to get one shot. It's going to get at least 2 attacks in every single game, and if you can take that option away from them, they're in a bit of trouble. It takes a lot to build up a Golem. You have to evolve it twice. You have to get 4 energy onto it. That's resources that aren't being committed elsewhere. It can be very, very difficult for them to bounce back if you play the Celebi deck correctly and you're able to get that one shot on the Golem. So overall, this is probably my favorite slow fighting deck build. It has a lot of answers to a lot of the matchups. The Golem is just so fun to play with. I've always wanted there to be a good Golem. He's never good in the real TCG, and this deck is just everything I love. You have the sniping potential, you have the revenge attack, and then you have that big walling tank of Golem that can also get one-shots. It is just a perfect deck to me. I really, really love it. It's still performing decently well. It hasn't done quite as good as it did in its very first tournament showcasing, but it's still around. It's still getting placement, so I don't really think Golem's going anywhere. I think it's still a fantastic deck, and if I was to play a slow build of fighting, this is the one I would go for. So let's move on to the Machamp deck, our last of the slow style fighting type decks. This runs on a lot of the same principles that Golem does. You have the Hitmonlee to weaken some things up or just take out Magikarps before they evolve. We're using the Meowth. This is the best placing list of Machamp. I have also seen some variants running Druddigon plus a Marshadow instead of the 2 Meowth in the 1 Persian line. Rest of the deck list is essentially the same. So if you want to try the Druddigon version, just swap those cards out for 2 Druddigon and a Marshadow. Now, just from looking at this deck and my first ideas with it, it just feels like Golem, but worse. It seems like you would take a slightly worse Mewtwo matchup. You now have the risk of Mewtwo roping in a Giovanni play to just one-shot your Machamp and give up 2 prizes. Does the same amount of damage as Golem. The only difference is that it doesn't need 4 energy attached to it in order to attack, but Golem has the Brock to kind of fix that. So I guess more consistently you could get an attack off with the Machamp because you don't rely on Brock. You might be able to get an attack in with Machamp a little bit faster. But on the same hand, you're committing 1 energy to the Meowth to be able to draw cards. So this deck aims to be just a little bit faster than Golem is with that Meowth. It's going to let you churn through your deck just that little bit quicker. So that's one strength it has over Golem. How relevant is that really? I'm not entirely sure. It might make it so your Hitmonlee on Magikarp is just slightly more likely, right? You're playing all the same outs to it that the Golem deck is, but with the Meowth there, you have just a little bit more card draw. So you might be able to knock out that Magikarp before it becomes a Gyarados just a little bit more consistently than the Golem deck can. Other than that, I mean, effectively, you have the same HP as a Golem. Golem technically has a little bit more because Golem gets up to 190 in order to one-shot it with his damage reduction. Damage reduction is just better than having more HP, because that damage reduction is going to mean that every single attack is going to be reduced by 30. So you're over 2 turns, you're net 40 HP more than this Machamp EX has. Even the potions would just even that up. So that's 2 more cards you need on the Machamp in order to make it have effectively the same HP as a Golem attacking twice. So because of that, I really just feel like this is a slightly worse Golem deck. Again, it has that little bit of speed over the Golem, but for the most part, the Machamp isn't really doing anything better than the Golem is. Hitting for the same amount of damage, but it's giving up 2 prizes if it gets knocked out. That means that a Marshadow play is not going to be as likely. Your opponent's probably going to knock out your Meowth before you get into that Machamp. It only has 60 HP. It's very squishy. A lot of Pokemon can deal with that very, very quickly. And then it's just your opponent's just a Machamp knockout away from winning the game. You don't really have the advantage of the Marshadow. You can't utilize it because of just the way that the prize exchange usually works out. So the Golem deck feels like it has more options over this. It's something to play if you want to dust off the Machamps in your binder. But other than that, I would probably say that Golem overall is the better deck. Let's take a look at the first of the faster style fighting type decks, and this is just a Greninja fighting type box. So you really want to be running just fighting energy because you do want to be using that Hitmonlee as early as possible or the Hitmonchan as early as you can. You don't want that option potentially taken away from you because the energy zone isn't doing what you want it to. I just made a video on this deck yesterday highlighting all of the matchups, doing some games with it. So but again, we play 2 Hitmonlee in this one. We're really doubling down on the idea of knocking out a Magikarp quickly. We're also, the Hitmonlee is great for setting up damage here. Your highest damage is going to be Tauros, and Tauros does not have enough HP to really live more than 1 turn. Tauros is going to attack once, and that's most likely going to be it. There are chances where the Tauros gets to survive. If you get a Tauros powered up early before your opponent can get set up, it can be very, very powerful. But for the most part, you want to plan for the Tauros just getting 1 attack in. So the Hitmonlee spreading damage around and weakening up your opponent's big powered up EXs is very, very important. You need that Tauros to come in and knock out the biggest threat and kind of set your opponent back a little bit. The Greninja is here to just fix up some damage numbers. I mean, with Greninja plus Hitmonlee, you've been doing 50 damage to the bench every single turn. Your Marshadow will have a much better range on things that it can one-shot with that Giovanni plus the Greninja ping. Now you're hitting 130 with the Marshadow. Very, very good. With the Greninja ping plus a Giovanni, you're now one-shotting Mewtwo's with Tauros, which is very, very important. So this deck has been pretty fun. I don't think that I would rank it higher than any of these other fast style fighting type decks, but it is, you know, a single prize deck. If that's the kind of decks that you like to run, if you just love Greninja like me, this might be an option for you. Just quickly, because again that our damage cap is so low and our Pokemon are really pretty squishy, this deck struggles a lot against some of those higher HP Pokemon that we're not hitting for weakness. Mainly any decks with Articunos or Starmies. It can have trouble against Celebes because your Hitmonlee plus Greninja damage is usually just going to get healed off by Ericas or potions that they typically run, and your Tauros is just going to get 1 attack in before it gets most likely knocked out by a Celebi. And lastly, Celebi is just pretty quick. They can ramp up fast. They don't need much on that first Celebi in order to take 1 prize card and then just kind of start rolling the ball in their favor. So this deck does have its problems. It doesn't really have the strongest late game from what I've seen. You can get rushed off the board pretty quickly because you have very tiny HP Pokemon compared to these EXs, and you need a bit of time to get set up. Tauros needs 3 energy attachments. Marshadow needs 2 energy attachments. You're going to need like 5 or 6 turns just to have all of your guys powered up and ready to go. And the Hitmonlee and the Hitmonchan are really not buying you a lot of time to do so. So some pretty glaring weaknesses. It takes very good matchups against the decks it wants to see. This deck wants to see Pikachu. It wants to see Gyarados. It's going to do fine against those. But the other decks, it feels like a real uphill battle just trying to get some wins against them. From here, we're going to be talking about Aerodactyl variants, and the first one I want to touch on is the Marowak Aerodactyl. So this one has not been performing as well as some of the other Aerodactyl variant I'm going to show you, but this one does have the option for some late game attacks. Marowak, with his Bone Ring attack, it can hit for 160 HP. It can give you an out if you just haven't been able to, sweep your opponent off the board fast enough. You will have that option of potentially hitting for 160 with the Marowak, which, I mean, sometimes you just need that. Sometimes you got to flip 2 heads in order to win the game. The rest of the deck, it's just Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee. Again, the same thing. Hitmonlee is there to soften up Pokemon on the bench. It's also there to knock out Magikarps before it does anything. It has the Marshadow because it's just a great tool in these fighting type decks. The revenge attack is so strong, especially into Pikachu. It's so hard for them to deal with that. But the Marowak does function as a really decent early game attacker as well. If you start Cubone and you get an attachment on it, and then you can get into Marowak turn 2, it's going to be very hard for a lot of decks to overcome that 140 HP Marowak. And if coin flips are at least going consistently for you, you could be dealing 80 damage a turn, potentially that 160 as discussed before. So Marowak, when set up quickly, can be very scary to deal with. The Aerodactyl is here. His ability sometimes comes into play. I've never really found it too relevant, but it is something your opponent has to play around. But a lot of Pokemon just want to be evolving on the bench anyway, so usually Aerodactyl isn't going to be doing too much with its ability, but it is a potential end of game, 140 HP, does 80 damage. Pretty solid, depending on the decks you're playing against. If they can't hit that 140 number, then Aerodactyl is going to be able to get 2 hits in, or it can hit once, take a hit, and then move to the bench, go into a Marowak or something else to continue attacking with. So a little bit of prize denial there. 140 HP is not a bad number at all to have. It's really good against things like Arcanine EX. That deck struggles against this because our EXs are just out of range, and Arcanine really just wants to be one-shotting whatever's in front of it. You're also just faster than Arcanine. You can get attacking on turn 2. They can't unless they hit like 3 heads on Inferno Dance, or they hit 2 heads and have a Leaf in hand to retreat the Moltres. It gets a little bit tricky for them, so we can kind of just outspeed that deck. Gyarados, again, the plan is to take out those Magikarps before they ever evolve, but if not, the Hitmonlee's there to weaken the Gyarados, and then I guess if you can only get 1 ping with a Hitmonlee down, you have the option of Marowak to potentially one-shot it. So Marowak has felt pretty good. I like that it doesn't mean you're out of the game at the very end, because a lot of these decks do sadly have the ability to hit for 140 HP. While it's not a bad number, it's not the best number either. You're going to be worried about Mewtwo's just kind of rolling through you once they get set up. Gyarados is going to one-shot your guys if you can't find that Hitmonlee fast enough. Celebi is going to be a big problem. You really got to try to outspeed Celebi in order to win that matchup. So yeah, it's like a middle of the road. It's fast, but it's not the most aggressive fighting type deck in the game. Gives you a little bit of late game options. Again, this one hasn't been performing as well as the other Aerodactyl variants, but if you really love Marowak and you really enjoy having that potential late game cleanup from the Marowak, it's really the only version of fighting decks that is both fast and going to give you that late game option. So if all of those sound good to you, I would give the Marowak deck a try. This is our final deck we're going to talk about today, and I'm pretty happy to see that this is the route we've gone with Aerodactyl that has been performing the best. Mainly because while I've enjoyed the Primeape that came out in the very first set, I've always thought it felt just a little bad when you go first. When you go first, the value of that Primeape tanks. You're almost never going to be able to set up the damage needed from Mankey's attack and then get into the Primeape if you go first. It's so difficult. Your opponent only needs to hit for 40 damage on the second turn in order to pull that off. So this deck elects to go with the new Mankey and the new Primeape. This Primeape hits for 50 for 1 energy. That's good because that means that your energies can start going elsewhere after you've already put 1 on the Primeape. The Mankey, if you hit heads plus a Giovanni, could just knock out your opponent's only basic Pokemon on your first turn. It's also just, you might as well go for it, and 50 damage is pretty relevant. So if you hit it, you're in a great spot already. But once you get into that Primeape, you can start picking off little HP Pokemon with that Giovanni. again, you have the Hitmonlee here in order to ping those Magikarp, set up damage elsewhere. I really like how few basic Pokemon this deck plays. It only plays 4 basics. You don't need to run, the old Ambers don't count as basic. So your Pokeballs are going to be very, very high value in getting what you need. So you can really consistently get into that Hitmonlee early game. Your chances are pretty high because of that. And that just makes it have a much better Gyarados matchup. Getting into that Hitmonlee early is so important. The Primeape's just going to do that early aggressive damage. Like I said, I mean, it's just going to be hitting for 50 every single turn. Depending on what your opponent's starting with, that can be a lot to deal with. 50 energy for 1 attachment. That's going to give you the time to set up that Aerodactyl and to set up that Marshadow. Now, like I said, this deck really has no late game plan outside of trying to bounce around 2 Aerodactyl. But if your opponent gets off to a fine start before you've been able to just run them off the board, take enough prizes, do enough damage, do enough early damage with Primeape or Hitmonlee, things are going to get really out of hand. This deck's late game potential, if your opponent is setting up better than you expect and you're not doing what you need to do, it's just tough, man, because your only play is going to be bouncing between those Aerodactyls. And like I said earlier in the video, a lot of these decks can one-shot Aerodactyl. It's not like the perfect wall like a Golem or a Machamp is. So its late game struggles. But when you're playing against decks like Pikachu or Gyarados or any of these other slower to evolve decks, like anything that sits behind a Druddigon, you're going to have a pretty great time because you're going to be very aggressive. You're going to be able to just consistently poke whatever's hiding on the bench with Hitmonlee. It does very, very well against decks like that. Things like Arcanine, I mean, it can win against Arcanine, but you're going to be getting into a 2-shot war against that fully powered up Arcanine, and you just have nothing that's going to hit for that damage needed on Arcanine, right? Arcanine's going to be able to come in, take a knockout, and then tank a hit from anything else you have if you did not set up damage prior with that Hitmonlee, and take 2 prizes with it, and then they have whatever else in the back set up to come and finish the game. So that's a hard matchup. Starmie, Articuno, not a deck that we see too much, but I can see it being a little bit difficult as well. They just have a lot of big HP Pokemon. They're not really going to care too much about Hitmonlee. Hitmonlee's probably only going to get 1, maybe 2 attacks off before it gets knocked out, and then the pressure is back on you. So the weaknesses of this deck are other decks that are just as fast as it, but don't have to worry about weakness. So again, Celebi is going to be hard. Starmie Articuno or any Articuno variant is going to be a little bit tricky for you. Arcanine can be tough because it has a lot of HP, and you have to get through both Moltres and an Arcanine before you're taking any prizes. Not easy for this deck to do. So this deck really, a lot of the fighting type stuff, a lot of these fighting type fast decks just play matchup roulette. You're just hoping to see the decks that you are favored against, that you specifically have great counterplay to, and then just like with that Greninja deck I discussed earlier, once you start to see some of these other decks that don't have any inherent weaknesses to your game plan, things start to fall apart a little bit. So all of these fighting decks have been doing so well because the matchup spread in the meta is so in their favor right now. If you hit the right matchups, you are going to do very, very well in tournaments or just on the ladder. You can win these bad matchups simply just by being faster than them. So you're never quite out of it with these fighting decks. Now, while I still don't think they're diverse enough, specifically these fast type fighting decks, I still don't think they're diverse enough for me to put them like top of the meta. I think they're great counter picks, and their speed allows them to steal games that they really don't have business winning. Just for personal enjoyment wise, that Golem deck is still my favorite out of all of the fighting decks. I typically don't like playing decks that don't have much of an end game strategy like this one does. And Golem just feels like the best of both worlds. It can do some things early on aggressively with that Hitmonlee, and once you get that Golem set up, you don't really care what your opponent's doing as long as they didn't set up a Charizard or a big Celebi. So that's my favorite of the fighting decks. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you've been testing anything I haven't shown here that you found more success with than some of these other variants. I would love to know. There's a lot of ways to play fighting right now. There still seems like we could iron out things, make them just a little bit more perfect. But for right now, it seems like Aerodactyl, Primate, and Golem are really the two decks that are on top. So I'm interested to see if we find some better way to play fighting than those two. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good one.